Have you ever had a dream when you fall asleep? Was it out of anything you can imagine? Did it felt real? These are the questions we ask ourselves as dreamers who are taken off reality into the stage of sleep where we see images, ideas, emotion, and more from our experience when dreaming. I can't fully explain what dreams actually are because we all have our own dreams and they are vastly different when I talk about dreams with other people who have dreams. Also, many of us who dream can't remember what we dreamed about, that we just forget about it and move back to our own reality. Whether they're good dreams or nightmares, dreams fascinate many of us because it's a stage that is unexplainable, but yet it seems significant to us because our dreams doesn't occur with anyone else except to that individual that dreamed it. Many find it so significant that they decide to make fictional stories about dreams, which expanded our theories and views on dreams. And wouldn't you know, there is an adventure about dreams in a video game. In 1999, a video game company from Norway called Funcom has released a game called The Longest Journey, exclusively on the PC. The Longest Journey is a point-and-click adventure game that is set in a parallel universe of two different worlds: Stark, the world ruled by logic, rationality, science, and technology, and Arcadia, governed by mythology, faith, and magic. Once there was a time that both of these universes were one, with the balance of magic and science in the nature of all people, until mankind exploit this power of magic and science for their own selfish needs, which brought unbalance between the two powers and corrupted the cosmos. Their only solution to bring back the balance was to divide magic and science into two different worlds, and each world is only visible to the other by the way of dreams, and thus was the becoming of Arcadia and Stark. For centuries, these neighboring worlds have lived in harmony, all because of the balance that maintains the equilibrium between these divides. However, the balance is now in danger. In The Longest Journey, you play as a young visual arts student named April Ryan. She just moved to the big city from the countryside. She has a part-time job working in a bar, but what she really wants was to apply as a student in the Venice Academy of Visual Arts. Everything seems to resemble the normal student life of a typical teenager, except that April is more than she thinks she is. She is able to shift from Stark to Arcadia through her dreams. Not believing that her dreams and nightmares were actually real, an old man named Cortez knew about the dreams April was having and showed her the gateway to Arcadia, where April's quest in saving the balance in both worlds has begun. In The Longest Journey, you travel in both the Stark world and Arcadia world. Each area and places you go is very different from the other in terms of atmosphere. One part of the game you are in a cyberpunk futuristic world and the other in a medieval/fantasy world, which makes it feel almost like they're two different games, and is a great combination of science fiction and fantasy, which works incredibly well. The designs in these games are spectacular to look at. Each corner and places you go, the background really does feel like a painting with moving 3D models in front of it. I find the presentation of The Longest Journey quite remarkable, as you have so many beautiful backgrounds in the whole game. Through your adventure, you will encounter a lot of interesting characters in both Arcadia and Stark. In the world of Stark, you'll see April's world and the people she knows as they play a different part of the story. You'll be seeing how April lives her life by witnessing how she interacts with the characters and how the cyberpunk world of Stark goes. Like for example, when you interact with a police officer, when he's done talking to April, he starts advertising products like a commercial salesman as part of his job. You'll learn more about the world's technology, how society is governed, and so much more that makes exploring and discovering Stark feel adventurous. Same goes for Arcadia, as it has a different experience, not only because it's in a fantasy world, but unlike traveling Stark, where April is familiar with her world, which hardly has any exposition, in Arcadia, it feels more adventurous because both the player and the main character is unfamiliar with the world of magic and learns more about Arcadia than they do with Stark. To be honest, the characters in Arcadia is much more interesting than it is with Stark because you have a huge world with so many medieval-like characters and magical creatures to communicate with. I find Arcadia more adventurous because you can help more characters than in Stark, where you don't have characters in need for help, but rather cause problems and conflict. I mean, a lot of people in Stark are a dick to April, but in Arcadia, they are much more amused and nicer to April, which I'm glad that there was more portion of The Longest Journey in Arcadia than in Stark. Back on the characters, like I said, each of them play an important role, either helping April, asking for help which leads her to somewhere, or as part of the conflict with April. I must say that there are a lot of memorable characters as you continue throughout The Longest Journey. Each of the characters has very well done voice acting and well written dialogue. We're talking about voice acting and dialogue that will instantly pull you into suspense of disbelief. It made interacting with any character feel very engaging. Even more surprising, Since Funcom is a Norway video game company, it's amazing that they managed to put excellent English voice acting on the table, because there are a lot of foreign companies that still to this day make very horrible English translations and dubs. But here, it felt like The Longest Journey was made by an American company, and it's really surprising to see that. Not saying that foreign countries can't speak English well, it's just that in comparison to the other video game companies that are set in a non-English country, like many Japanese companies, they have a very hard time trying to port it to other countries, and I have to give Funcom a lot of credit for doing so. One of my favorite characters in the entire game has to be Crow. The talking, Crow. Touché. Even though he's displayed for comedic relief, he is definitely an enjoyable character and kept a nice balance of a comedic character, but also an important character. So does April Ryan. I mean, how could you not laugh at her smart-ass comments? Every time when I see those two together, I always put a smile on my face. Seeing them argue and talk were the best part of the whole game for me. At the same time, the more characters you encounter, the more you'll know about April Ryan as her character, as she develops, and we as a viewer learn more about her past, as it does play a significant part of the story. From the memorable characters, the original setting, presentation and writing, everything I said in this review should already tell you that this is one of the most amazing complex stories that you can ever find in gaming. It took me this long discussing about the plot because it's something not easy to explain, which shows how complex the game actually is. And unlike my other reviews, I never take this long in talking about the game's story, which should tell you that this game is a phenomenal piece of literature. But yet, I haven't even discussed about the gameplay yet. So let's get right to it. Since this is a point-and-click adventure game, you can interact with anything you see within your range. Picking up items, interacting with whatever object is available, and more was just enjoyable as it was to other adventure games I've experienced. Gameplay-wise, it's not anything revolutionary or different from all the other point-and-click adventures that has already been released. It's simplistic, but you don't want it to be any more complex than how the story already is. But like all adventure games, there are a lot of places to explore, clues to look for, and puzzles to solve, which is the biggest challenge of the game. Most of the puzzles are fairly simple, which is not a bad thing considering that you don't want to be stuck in one portion of the game when you're witnessing a great story in a video game. In this case, the puzzles here are there to drive the story, which is the real focus in almost every adventure game. If the puzzles were too hard, then you would just give up and miss out on the wonderful story. Veterans of adventure games shouldn't really find it too hard to solve these puzzles, but again, gamers who aren't familiar with this genre will be frustrated. This game definitely isn't short, but thankfully the title, The Longest Journey, wasn't false advertising. But I will say, however, that the biggest flaw I have with The Longest Journey is that it wasn't long because of the places you have to go, but rather, it's long because of the lengthy dialogue when you're in a conversation with a character. Not to complain or anything, but this gives the Metal Gear series a run for its money for having the longest dialogue I've ever encountered in a video game. Not with just one character, many countless characters. And for every character that you talk to, important ones that is, it takes almost over 10 minutes for them to finish a conversation and get anywhere. I wouldn't say that it's worth every minute just to go through these long conversations because of some of the most well done voice acting, but it pushed my patience a bit much when the conversation takes over 10 minutes. Heck, when April Ryan confronted one of the antagonists of the game, they spent over 10 minutes just talking about random stuff and it didn't get anywhere. And that's including a very little amount of choosing your dialogue, which is what adventure games are most known for. There were many times that I almost passed out because of having too many off-topic chats that has little to do with the story, where it was at the point where I almost gave up. I mean, it was great for a certain degree, but it gets really tiresome at a certain point. But at a gaming experience, it does get better the more you play out of this game. But even though the lengthy conversation is the biggest flaw, but in my eyes, if you're going to tell a good story, not only you're going to have to put a lot of effort in using characters in good roles and tell us something original, but also have well-written dialogue, character development, good character interactions, and so many things that relates to the audience, all in which it fits the story. And that's what The Longest Journey has done better than most games out there. Even 10 years after this game was released, The Longest Journey is still very engaging to play, which tells me that this game is timeless. It took its audience seriously in telling a mature, but yet a magical story, and did things new without having any cliche in them. What's even better is the execution all the way to the end. Throughout The Longest Journey, you'll find this game dramatic, funny, sad, thrilling, scary, and all of the emotions which made a brilliant experience in the video game. I give The Longest Journey a 5 fingers out of 5. It blends in science fiction and fantasy so well that I've never seen anything quite like this before. If you want to experience some of the best and more original storytelling in video games, look no further than The Longest Journey, because there's no experience quite like this. Now, jumping into the sequel. It has been 7 long years since The Longest Journey was released, and many fans were anticipated for the sequel. And this was something that was beyond expectations. In 2006, Funcom has released the sequel of The Longest Journey, calling it Dreamfall, The Longest Journey. Now, before I continue on, I have to say a lot has changed in the video game industry since the release of The Longest Journey. Speaking of which, adventure games has lost a great amount of popularity, and so many games continuing the genre reinvented the wheel. One of those games that did adventure games very differently was Shenmue for the Dreamcast, keeping elements of what makes an adventure game and added new ones like real-time effect, a moving camera, more non-linear exploration, and so much more. Even though Shenmue and Shenmue 2 didn't make commercial success, there were games afterwards that were trying to keep the adventure game genre alive by following its transformation, and Dreamfall, The Longest Journey was one of them. Having this change definitely make this a totally different experience from point-and-click adventure games. This is the first time the series has gone multi-plat, available for the PC, Xbox, and a couple of years ago, available in Xbox Live Marketplace. And with that decision of putting the sequel in the console, there's going to be a lot of console gamers who haven't played The Longest Journey before jumping to the sequel, because The Longest Journey was exclusively for the PC. With so many never experienced the original, Funcom has decided to make a new main character and cast, but still managed to make it a direct sequel by bringing back the old and continue from what was left off from The Longest Journey. The main character you play as is Zoe Castillo, who's just like April Ryan, who's trying to find the right life for her, but seems to not have things to go as planned. She couldn't get past through college, has a failed relationship with her boyfriend, who she hoped to marry one day, and no career offered for her forces her to live at her father's place because she has nowhere else to go. She wants to be needed and find something that she was destined for. This is on a personal note, but immediately I can strongly relate to Zoe because as a college student, I struggled the same issues and want more from life than just being stuck in one typical lifestyle. Zoe lives in the Stark world, as she should already know. It's a world that was ruled by logic and science. Like everyone else in that world, she doesn't know anything about Arcadia, and once again, the balance between both worlds is at peril. One day, Zoe started to see random appearances of a little girl on every television screen, giving her the message to find April Ryan. So what happened to April, you may ask? Well, she's stuck in Arcadia and can never go back to Stark because she lost her ability to shift between both worlds. In Arcadia, she does her part in protecting the balance in Arcadia and is at war with the Azandi Empire and does not want to be part of Stark anymore. No one but Zoe knows about these random appearances from this little girl, and she does not know what to do until her journalist ex-boyfriend Reza asks her to pick up a package for him at a place called Jiva. But things suddenly became out of the ordinary when Zoe realized that the place was under attack. She saved one of the workers from Jiva and is all confused. Eventually, Reza goes missing, and Zoe becomes worried for Reza because of the mysterious murders and the police that are after him. Then she got a message from Reza from her mechanical stuffed animal called Wonkers and told her half the story about the story that he's working on and asked her to do some more favors because he can't trust anybody else but her. Zoe's search for Reza leads her to America, Japan, and soon find her way to Arcadia, and thus leads her to one of the biggest adventures of a lifetime. Throughout the game, not only you play as Zoe, but also multiple characters such as Kane Alvani, Zondi Soldier, and skilled swordsman who resides the holy city of Sadir, and most of all, you get a chance to play as April Ryan once again. You switch to either one of those characters at certain parts of Dreamfall, seeing their perspective of the character's adventure, as our main character can't always be there to witness everything. Since Dreamfall is a new style adventure game which I call full 3D graphical adventure, seeing the world in The Longest Journey is a new experience. You still have exploration, item collecting, ability to start a conversation with characters, and puzzle solving to keep Dreamfall in as an adventure game. But Funcom also added more to the game, action and stealth. And I have to say, both of them failed. I can see where they were going with this because it does fit the story, but it just didn't work. First, let me criticize the fighting mechanics, because it was not exactly the worst, but probably the weakest I've ever seen in a video game. You have to make a good reach in order to hurt any of your enemies, and sadly, there is hardly any good reach in hitting your target, as there is a chance where you get into a distance where you finally reach them, they can also hurt you, having more of an advantage of defeating you before you defeat them. You only got 3 commands, block, light attack, and heavy attack, but either one of those two, you can hardly feel the impact you give on your enemies, plus the enemy AI is mediocre and boring to encounter. Other games before Dreamfall had good fighting mechanics and it was engaging to encounter foes. Here it just utterly fails, where whenever I play this game and I see someone to fight, I just sigh and say to myself, let's just get this over with. But thankfully there isn't that many fight sequences. And thus leads us to our next element introduced to the series, stealth. It is just as weak as the combat. I say it's weak because you can hardly use your environment to blend in as camouflage, and all you do is tiptoe very slowly so that no one can hear you. But like all games that has stealth elements, when you're spotted, you're fucked. The way I see it, I see this element as the most important part of the story because Zoe must discover places that the antagonist wouldn't want anyone to know, but it just made everything frustrating to manage when at this part of the game. It's even worse when you have to be in stealth to solve a puzzle rather than exploring places. Speaking of puzzles, the puzzles here are at the bottom of the barrel basic. Other adventure games, puzzle solving has some excitement in solving them, and it does fit the story of the game. But in comparison to all the other puzzles, especially The Longest Journey, Dreamfall's puzzles are really tedious to go through when puzzles are meant to be somewhat exciting when solving them. Well, I have to admit that the stealth puzzles were somewhat intense, but again, that's only when you're facing the mediocre element of the game and trying your best not to get caught. However, one big flaw I found with the game is that there are too many load times. I wouldn't have such a problem with it if only there were some areas that weren't too small and under 60 feet in range. But thankfully the load times weren't that long. Also, not to mention that I figured out at a certain point of the game that all I've been doing was getting to one cutscene to the next. With all the complaints I have of Dreamfall The Longest Journey, why am I reviewing this game? If you even call it a game. I never ever want to review any bad games on my channel because they're not worthy for my attention. So why did I review this game? Why did I put so much attention in discussing about this game as it could have just been forgettable and also in the same league with all the other games with a bad reputation? Well, here's the main reason why going through the mediocrity is worth a damn. The story. When I describe how spectacular The Longest Journey story was, in my honest opinion, Dreamfall The Longest Journey has a much better plot, and I'm not saying that lightly at all. Like every adventure game that I fucking played, Dreamfall starts out very slow, but when you get started with your adventure, it gets more and more engaging, which puts me in the stage beyond the suspense of disbelief. The Longest Journey was just a journey between two worlds and know what it's about, found with so many characters and complex storytelling. But in Dreamfall, not only are you rediscovering everything you have seen from The Longest Journey, but it expanded the universe and you got a much better plotline than ever before. The new antagonists are much more plausible, threatening, and intimidating, which made saving the balance in the two worlds more intense than it did with The Longest Journey. What Dreamfall did better than the prequel was the characters and dialogue. Let's be honest here, there were a lot of characters in The Longest Journey that kept going on and on about stuff that didn't really go anywhere, and the lengthy dialogue was just tiresome. But in Dreamfall, even though the dialogue was just as long, at least they went somewhere and made it more engaging and straightforward. The characters tell you what you need to know, they lead you to somewhere, which is what a character should do when they're in part of the story, and they have a lot of value when talking to them. Not once when I was watching any of those cutscenes that I felt it was tiresome. The voice acting was just as spectacular as they immediately grasp you into the story, and you could see so much heart that was put into this. Unlike The Longest Journey, where whenever you talk to a character, you're basically staring at the same background for a very long time until the conversation's over and lets you go freely. Since Dreamfall is fully in 3D, it feels like a cinematic experience to have different camera angle shots when watching the cutscenes. The best part of Dreamfall, speaking as The Longest Journey fan here, is that you get a chance to see familiar faces like Charlie and Elma, Brian Westhouse, the villagers of Arcadia, and especially Crow. Man, words cannot describe how happy I was to see Crow again because it brought back the comedic relief in this game, which I felt was needed. Another great thing about Dreamfall The Longest Journey is that it has really mesmerizing level designs. I mean, it's probably the most beautiful looking level designs I've ever seen in a video game, and it did not use HD to make it look good. Every corner and area I encountered was just glamorous to look at. And this is a feeling that I only get when I go to an art gallery, and there are only a few games out there that gets me this feeling. and Dreamfall is one of them. I love seeing the flying vehicles going by in Stark and see how lovely looking the nature and medieval environments are in Arcadia. Yeah, you can be nitpicky about the character animation lacking facial expressions in many cases, but it still doesn't destroy the beauty of this game. Even though I have a lot of issues with Dreamfall, I have to say it's definitely a true sequel to The Longest Journey. If you play games only for the gameplay, stay away from Dreamfall because its target audience was for story fans. The way I see telling a story in a video game, it's balanced between story and gameplay. In my eyes, if you're going to tell a very good story, then the gameplay will be dumbed down. At Dreamfall's case, there are hardly any redeeming quality in the gameplay because it's mediocre at best. But for the story, however, I know I may sound biased for saying this, but I have to say that it is literally the best video game story I have ever encountered in gaming. And I've played a lot of games that was praised for their story, and it is subjective of what you prefer, but going through the story in Dreamfall The Longest Journey was almost like reading a novel that is a piece of literature. Just like the prequel, it was a great combination of science fiction and fantasy, but Dreamfall went beyond adventurous, having so many characters play a bigger part of the story that felt very engaging. Every conversation was worthwhile, and the surprises made in Dreamfall just blew me away. It felt incredibly epic to witness really awesome scenes that I find very memorable. I would love to talk more about how great the story is, but talking any more of it will ruin the experience for those who haven't played it yet. So I'm telling you right now, for those who are watching this review that plays games for the story, I strongly recommend you to get this game on Steam, Xbox Live On Demand, or hard copy on Xbox or PC. Or hell, watch the walkthrough in this game because from beginning all the way to the end, I was just blown away with the execution that this game has made. I know that there are a lot of people complaining, "This is not a video game, it's an interactive movie." If so, then it has to be the best interactive movie I have ever seen in my life. I've never done this in any of my reviews, and I'll never do it again, but in order to be very fair in this review, I'm going to have to give you two different ratings for Dreamfall The Longest Journey. For the gameplay, however, I give it a 2 fingers out of 5. But for the story, just for the story alone, this was just more than a 6 fingers out of 5. This is my highest score, and the first time ever, I give the story for Dreamfall The Longest Journey a 7 fingers out of 5. It was an amazing experience to see a plot just like Dreamfall, and nobody can convince me otherwise. But just because I give the story for Dreamfall The Longest Journey a 7 fingers out of 5 does not mean that it's in my top 10 favorite games of all time, because the gameplay is mediocre at best. My favorite games of all time should all have fantastic gameplay in order for it to be in the list that I will review one day. I personally think that the plot in Dreamfall should have been in a different media rather than a video game because, to be honest, the gameplay was just tiresome. But the cutscenes were incredibly memorable, and it just moved on with the story into an amazing conclusion that I personally will always cherish. But whatever the case, Dreamfall's story is something very special to me that I will always remember throughout my experience with storytelling. The story in Dreamfall The Longest Journey is one of my favorite stories ever. Thank you all for watching this review and all the support you all have given me. On my next video, it's a follow-up review where I'll be talking about Dreamfall's story, and it contains many spoilers that I strongly recommend you to play the game or see a walkthrough on YouTube, because if you let me spoil this game for you, it will just ruin the excitement on this fantastic adventure. This will be my last adventure game I'll be reviewing until further notice. Till then, thank you for all your support, and stay tuned for more on Dreamfall The Longest Journey.